Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about the presidents of the Progressive Era, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson are considered pretty progressive, whereas William Howard Taft is considered more of a conservative. But we're going to look at these three men today. Now, the first progressive president we're looking at is Teddy Roosevelt. Love him or hate him, he's kind of one of the most exciting presidents in American history. If you're interested in reading a great biography about him, I would suggest Edmund Morris's 3-volume series, The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt, Theodore Rex, and then Colonel Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was born in 1858 in New York. He was a very weakly, sickly child. He suffered from extreme asthma. His parents tried all kinds of remedies to cure him. They gave him medicine that induced vomiting. They forced him to exercise. They even forced him to smoke cigarettes, which shows you how much times have changed. We don't force our kids to smoke cigarettes anymore when they're sick. As a young man, Roosevelt was interested in nature. He constantly brought animals into the house, both alive and dead. He even would stuff birds at a young age after he killed them. Roosevelt eventually gets older, goes to Harvard from 1876 to 1880. He attends law school for a couple years after that at Columbia University. At college, he was a very active student. He was active in social clubs. He started a book on the American Navy during his time there, a book on naval history. He fought in the lightweight boxing championship and lost while he was at Harvard. Now, the two most important things that happened to him while he was at college is first, his father died in his sophomore year. The two were very close. And then he ended up falling in love with Alice Hathaway Lee, and the two were married in 1880, the year he graduated. In 1882, Roosevelt was elected to the New York State Assembly, where he was a reformist, progressive Republican. He had a temper, and it wasn't good to make fun of him. There's one story where he was at a saloon frequented by New York politicians, and a Tammany Hall Democrat came up to him and started poking fun at the jacket TR was wearing. He supposedly said, "Won't mama's boy catch a cold?" Teddy Roosevelt punched him in the face and knocked him down. The guy got up and Teddy punched him 2 more times. And then supposedly at the very end of the fight, as the guy was walking away, he said, "When you are in the presence of gentlemen, conduct yourself like a gentleman." So kind of admonishes him to behave a certain way. Now, while he was serving as a politician in New York, tragedy struck. A few days after his wife gave birth to their daughter Alice, his wife and mother died. They died on the same day, February 14th, 1884. So the birth of his child, a very exciting event, is followed by the death of his wife and his mother. Roosevelt ends up giving the daughter to one of his sisters, and he leaves New York for Dakota, the Dakota Territory. He goes out to the Badlands and basically becomes a cowboy. He got made fun of a lot because he had a funny Eastern accent. He used very proper grammar and he wore glasses. The cowboys out west all made fun of him for this. But he did gain their respect because they found out that he was very tough and he could work very hard. There's kind of an interesting story I wanted to share with you. While Teddy Roosevelt was out west, living in the Dakotas, he had a boat on the Little Missouri River that ended up getting stolen. He was so angry that he planned to saddle his horse and chase the boat thieves down the river, kind of on his horse off to the side. He was convinced by some fellow cowboys that this wasn't good. It was in the middle of the winter. They said, "You'll probably just die chasing them on your horse." So Teddy Roosevelt ordered them to build a new boat. They spent a few days building a boat. Then they hop on the river and they start chasing these boat thieves. A few days later, they catch up with them and capture them. That Teddy Roosevelt said that they couldn't tie their hands because it was so cold. They would get frostbite and hypothermia if they didn't keep moving. They floated a little bit further down the river, but the nearest town was 150 miles away. So they hopped off the river and they basically marched overland. Teddy Roosevelt walked behind the criminals for 45 miles. Took a few days to get to the next town where they deposited the criminals. But Teddy Roosevelt used to share this story when he went back to New York. Now, he eventually does go back to New York and he remarries. He married his childhood friend, Edith Caro, and they'll have a number of children together. Teddy Roosevelt gets back into politics. He runs for mayor in 1886. He comes in third place. In 1889, he goes to Washington and serves as a civil service commissioner. In 1895, he was appointed one of the police commissioners for New York City. And then when William McKinley gets elected president in 1896, he ends up offering Teddy Roosevelt a job as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Teddy Roosevelt resigns that post when the Spanish-American War breaks out, and he forms a volunteer regiment known as the Rough Riders, and they go fight in the Spanish-American War. Now, after the war, Teddy comes back. He's a war hero. The political machine, the Republican political machine in New York, drafts him to run for governor of New York. Now, the party bosses thought he would be kind of in their pocket as governor, but Teddy Roosevelt turns out to be a very progressive, reformist governor of New York. He challenged the Republican Party bosses. He supports regulation. He enacts laws that preserve the forests of New York, and he works on labor in a number of issues. Now, the political bosses in New York wanted to get rid of him, so they kind of thought to themselves, how can we end Teddy Roosevelt's career and get him out of New York? So what they decide to do is they decide to have him run with William McKinley in 1900 as his vice presidential candidate. William McKinley's first vice president had died, so he needs a new one. This was almost a unanimous vote. It would have been unanimous, except Teddy Roosevelt voted against himself in the nomination for vice president. But he gets it, and William McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt win the election of 1900. But then tragedy strikes. William McKinley is killed by the anarchist Leon Czolgosz. He's shot in Buffalo, New York, and dies a number of days later. Mark Hanna was a Republican political boss and advisor to William McKinley. When McKinley died, Mark Hanna said, "Now look, that damned cowboy is president of the United States." So the kind of conservative Republicans intended to kill his career, but what they did is they catapulted him into the White House. Now, one of the first things Roosevelt does when he becomes president is he has a dinner at the White House with Booker T. Washington. This occurs in October of 1901. Now, Roosevelt supports civil rights for blacks. He supports anti-lynching laws, but he's also playing good politics here. Teddy Roosevelt knows that if he wants the Republican nomination in 1904, he's going to need all the delegates he can get. Booker T. Washington controls a lot of delegates in the South, so by having dinner, Teddy Roosevelt knows if he can win over Booker T. Washington, then he'll probably get the nomination in 1904. This dinner ends up causing a national sensation. Some were very angry about the dinner. Some praised the meeting, but the nation had different feelings. Senator Benjamin Tillman of South Carolina, he was a Democratic senator. This is what he said when he learned of the meeting. "The action of President Roosevelt in entertaining that Negro will necessitate our killing 1,000 Negroes in the South before they will learn their place again." Now, he didn't say Negroes, he said the N-word, but that just shows you how a lot of Democrats were upset about this meeting in the White House. Bishop Henry Turner, a black minister, said this: "You are about to be the great representative and hero of the Negro race." So different parts of the country felt differently about this dinner. But it does start his presidency off with kind of headline grabbing. It's kind of a headline grabber. Now, TR gets busy busting trusts right away. In 1902, he orders the Justice Department to bring an antitrust suit against J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Railroad. TR brought the suit under the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. This law had been passed. It was a weak antitrust law, but nonetheless, it was used to break up trusts. The case drags on for a couple of years, but in 1904, the courts do order that the Northern Securities be dissolved. Teddy Roosevelt said, "I believe in corporations. They are indispensable instruments of our modern civilization, but I believe they should be so regulated that they shall act for the interest of the community as a whole." So right from the start, Teddy Roosevelt goes down as the battler and defeater of the big trusts. Roosevelt signs a lot of later bills into law that rein in trusts and big business. The Elkins Act is passed in 1903. This prohibits discriminatory railway rates that favor preferred or powerful customers. It gives the government the power to fine the railroads if they do offer rebates. The Hepburn Act was passed in 1906. This sets maximum rates for the railroads. TR also signs into law the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, and he also creates the Food and Drug Administration. All of this is kind of in the aftermath of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, and it just is meant to make America's medicine and food safe for consumers. Teddy Roosevelt distinguished between good trusts and bad trusts. Basically, a good trust should be left alone because corporations can be good for America, but the bad trusts, the ones that harm their workers, underpay them, crush competition through monopoly, they should be broken up or they should be regulated heavily. So Teddy Roosevelt distinguishes between the two. There's a famous story, this picture that kind of shows Teddy Roosevelt trapping the bad trust and leaving the good trust alone, these teddy bears. There's a famous story about Teddy Roosevelt going down to Mississippi to hunt bears. And supposedly the story goes is they capture a bear and they say, "We've got a bear for you to shoot." And Teddy Roosevelt says, "No, I'm not going to shoot a captured bear. That's not very sporting, or that's not very manly." Well, soon this story gets in the newspapers, and somebody that was selling stuffed animals kind of seized upon it and decided to call the stuffed animals teddy bears. And that's kind of where the teddy bear comes from. Most people have heard this story, but the rest of the story, the real part, most people haven't heard. Teddy Roosevelt was hunting bears in Mississippi, and his hunting party did capture a bear. The dogs chased it into a pond. One of the hunting party threw a rope around the bear. It's a smaller bear. He wades out into the pond and pistol whips it and then drags it ashore, and the bear's all dazed and confused. And then they tell Teddy Roosevelt, "Hey, we've caught this bear. You can finally shoot one," because he really wanted to get one. And Teddy Roosevelt says, "No, it's not sporting to shoot a captured, injured bear." So what he has somebody do is kill it. So one of the hunting party goes over and kills it with a knife. So I guess you could say the first teddy bear was pistol whipped and then stabbed to death. Now, probably the biggest event of his first administration is the coal strike of 1902. Coal is the fuel that makes the nation run. It powers the factories that make steel. It heats people's homes. It keeps the railroads moving. Coal workers go on strike in 1902. They want higher wages, shorter hours. They want more safety, and they want recognition of their union. Now, what Roosevelt does is he calls the strikers together with the mine owners and tries to work out a compromise, but nothing ends up happening. The mine owners won't budge, the workers won't budge. So what Teddy Roosevelt does is he threatens to bring in the military, take over the mines, and basically run them without the mine owners. This causes the mine owners to cave. They end up giving their workers better pay and better safety. They do not recognize the Union, though. It won't really be until the 1930s that we get Union recognition throughout the United States. During this kind of incident, Teddy Roosevelt famously said, "The Constitution was made for the people, not the people for the Constitution." And if you think about it, this is quite a big difference between the way Grover Cleveland handled the Pullman strike in 1894, or even Rutherford B. Hayes handled the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. They both used troops to crush the strike and to get business going again. Teddy Roosevelt actually threatens to use the military to help the workers out. So this is a big shift kind of in American presidential policy. Teddy Roosevelt's domestic program, his trust busting, his regulation of corporations, his looking out for workers, it becomes known as the Square Deal. So Teddy Roosevelt talks about his Square Deal. That's kind of what he means. He also takes a lot of bold action in foreign policy. He helped the Panamanians declare revolution against the Colombians, and then he buys a strip of land from Panama to build the Panama Canal. Teddy Roosevelt issues something known as the Roosevelt Corollary, which basically says to Europe, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. We're going to be the policemen of the Caribbean. In one case, Teddy Roosevelt even occupied the island of Santo Domingo. The island had defaulted on its loans to some European countries. The European countries threatened to send in the military and take the money they need or they think they're owed. What Teddy Roosevelt does is he occupies the island. He collects customs duties, pays the Europeans back the debt that they're owed, but he also keeps them out of Santo Domingo, so that's kind of what he means by the Roosevelt corollary. Teddy Roosevelt sends battleships around the world. From 1907 to 1909, the Great White Fleet tours the world to kind of show that America is now a superpower. He wants especially Japan to kind of be weary. He sees Japan as a rival in the Pacific. Now, by the time the election of 1904 rolls around, Teddy Roosevelt has had a very positive first term. He's successfully negotiated an end to the coal strike. He started construction on the Panama Canal. He's won victories over the trusts. So in 1904, he runs on his accomplishments. His Democratic opponent, Alton B. Parker, is soundly defeated. You can see from this map, Teddy Roosevelt wins pretty much the whole country except the South. The Democratic South won't vote for him because he entertained Booker T. Washington at the White House and is pro-civil rights. Now, on election night, Teddy Roosevelt promises never to run again, so he promises not to run for a third term. He'll come to regret this later on. In his second term, he has some more success. He negotiates an end to the Russo-Japanese War. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize for this. If you add up his first and second terms, he creates something like 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, and 150 national forests. He protects the Grand Canyon from being commercialized. In all, he put something like 230 million acres of land under public protection, so he's a big conservationist. He wants to conserve nature so we can pass on the resources to later generations. Now, there is a panic in his second term. The economy did pretty well from 1904 to 1907, but then the panic of 1907 hits. Basically, some companies fail. There's a panic, but J.P. Morgan comes to the rescue. He pumps a lot of money into some of these failing companies, and he forestalls the Depression. But nonetheless, whenever you're president and there's a panic, you get blamed for it. Now, Roosevelt calls for a lot of reforms in his second term. He wants workers' compensation. He wants to enact child labor laws. He wants an 8-hour workday. He wants an income and inheritance tax. But Congress knows that he's a lame duck president since he promised not to run for a third term, so the Congress kind of ignores him, and none of his reforms get passed. So Teddy Roosevelt's second term, he's not as powerful as he is in his first term. Now, when it comes time for him to step down from the presidency, he picks William Howard Taft to run as his successor. Now, William Howard Taft said, "I agree heartily and earnestly with the policies which have come to be known as the Roosevelt policies." So basically, Roosevelt sees Taft as the person who will carry on the Roosevelt agenda and the Roosevelt reforms. Now, Taft runs against William Jennings Bryan in 1908. Taft crushes Bryan. Once again, Bryan pretty much wins the South, and that's really it. When TR leaves office in 1909, he goes on an African safari and a tour of Europe, which lasts over a year. So he's gone from 1909 to 1910. You know, in Africa, he kills something like 500 animals. 17 lions are included in that. A lot of the animals are stuffed and sent back to museums in the United States. So Teddy Roosevelt's kind of interesting. He likes nature, but he also likes to kill nature. Now, William Howard Taft, pretty much what everyone knows about him is that he's a very big president. He's over 300 pounds, and he gets stuck in the White House bathtub. Those stories are true, but I've got 2 things I want to read to you that I think are kind of funny. I have to read them because it's kind of long. But William Howard Taft was a Yale alumni, and one time an associate justice of the Supreme Court was giving a commencement speech at Yale, and he told this joke about William Howard Taft. He said, "Secretary Taft is the politest man alive. I heard that recently he arose in a streetcar and gave his seat to 3 women." Now, when the joke is told, everyone in the crowd laughs. And here's another story that I think is kind of funny. So William Howard Taft had gone to Asia, and he had sat in a sedan chair one time, and the sedan chair had collapsed under his weight. So when he's planning another trip, basically the American government negotiates with somebody to make a sedan chair that will carry his weight. So the guy that was going to build the sedan chair, his name is Yu Wo. That's his name. And this is the contract he signed saying he would build a sedan chair for William Howard Taft. It's kind of funny. Okay, here it is. I, the undersigned Yu Wo, agree to make a sedan chair for the American Consul General. This chair is to be used to carry the American giant, the Honorable William Howard Taft. Said Taft being one of the most conspicuous ornaments of the American Imperial Cabinet, it would obviously discredit this nation if their chair should disintegrate. To avert international complications of this sort, I, Yu Wo, assert my skill as a chair maker. So basically they got to build a special chair to avoid an international incident if it disintegrates under William Howard Taft. All joking aside, William Howard Taft has a very sharp legal mind. He was a judge before becoming president, and then after becoming president, he serves as the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. That was always his dream job. He's Governor General of the Philippines. He's a provisional governor of Cuba. He's Secretary of War under Roosevelt. In fact, Taft is TR's right-hand man on international affairs. But like I said, his main attribute is his legal mind. Now, Taft turns out not to be as progressive of a president as Teddy Roosevelt wished. One of the things Taft does is he signs into law the Payne-Aldrich Tariff of 1909. This is a very high tariff. It's got high levels of protectionism. And basically it shows that he's siding with big business, protect the big business of kind of the Northeast and the Midwest over the farmers of the country. But overall, Taft busted more trust than TR. Teddy Roosevelt, like I said, he believed, if you're a good trust, I'll leave you alone. If you're a bad trust, I'm going to break you up or regulate you. William Howard Taft said, the law says if you're a trust, you have to be broken up. I'm not going to pick which ones are good or bad. According to the law, they're all bad. They all squish competition, so I'm going to break them all up. And even though Taft only served one term, so he served half as much time as Roosevelt, he actually busts about twice as many trusts as Teddy Roosevelt does. Now, Taft eventually has a split with TR, and then it splits the entire Republican Party for the 1912 election. Basically, the first thing that happens is something called the Pinchot-Bollinger Affair. Chief Forster Gifford Pinchot was a Teddy Roosevelt appointee, and he accuses William Howard Taft's Secretary of the Interior, Richard Bollinger, of selling public lands to private developers so they can cut down the forests, mine for coal and other resources. This land is in Africa or Alaska, and it's disputed. Taft sides with his Secretary of the Interior, and he fires Teddy Roosevelt's man, Gifford Pinchot, who's kind of accusing the administration of selling out to the businessmen. The other thing that causes a split has to do with the United States Steel Corporation. Before Teddy Roosevelt left the presidency in 1907, he agreed that the U.S. Steel Corporation could acquire the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company. Now, this was basically creating a monopoly. The U.S. Steel is acquiring another company, which will basically make it a trust. But Teddy Roosevelt said this is a good trust. When Taft sees this deal as president, he says, nope, I'm not going to allow this, and he orders it to be broken up. So Teddy Roosevelt sees this as a personal attack on his basically judgment when he was president. So the two men basically have a falling out. The progressives side with Teddy Roosevelt, and the more conservative, business-oriented Republicans side with Taft. And this brings us to the election of 1912. It will split the Republican Party and put Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, in the White House. So before I talk about this, I want to just talk about Woodrow Wilson briefly. Now, Woodrow Wilson, he's born in Virginia in 1856, so he's a couple years older than Teddy Roosevelt. He remembers the Civil War. In fact, as a young boy, he witnessed Jefferson Davis being paraded through his town as the captured Confederate president. Wilson always felt the South was superior to the North. His college fellow classmates talked about how he was always defending the South when he went to college at Princeton. Now, Woodrow Wilson grew up struggling to read. A lot of historians think that he was dyslexic. But basically, he learns how to be a good speaker. He memorizes speeches, and eventually he learns to read. He grows up and goes to Princeton. There he falls in love and marries Ellen Axon. And basically, Woodrow Wilson becomes a college professor. He works at a number of different colleges. He's a very cold man. Teddy Roosevelt's very lively. Woodrow Wilson is very cold and distant. A reporter once said that shaking Woodrow Wilson's hand was like shaking a dead fish. Now, one of the things Woodrow Wilson does is he publishes something called Congressional Government, a study in American politics. He argues that the federal government is too weak. It needs to expand its powers in order to meet the needs of modern society. He wants a strong executive that can basically lead the nation where it needs to go. Now, in 1902, he gets his dream job and becomes president of Princeton University, and his progressive beliefs kind of start to bubble up. He once said, "Modern industry has so distorted competition as to put it into the power of some to tyrannize over many and enable the rich and strong to combine against the poor and the weak." While he's president of Princeton, his father dies. He was very close with his father, just like Teddy Roosevelt was close with his. His wife's wife's brother's wife and son also die in a drowning accident. So Wilson has a lot of tragedy while he's president of Princeton. He also loses sight in one of his eyes, and basically he has the symptoms of basically having a stroke. The doctors tell him that he needs to retire and basically rest if he wants to live. Otherwise, he's too stressed out and he's going to die. Now, eventually, he decides to take a long vacation. He goes to Great Britain and to Bermuda. When he's in Bermuda, he meets a woman named Mary Peck. They probably had an affair together. His wife, Ellen, finds some of their love letters later on when Woodrow Wilson comes home. But after Wilson takes some time off from being a college president, he gets healthy again. And in 1910, the Democrats in New Jersey ask him to run for governor of New Jersey. Wilson ends up winning, so he's governor of New Jersey from 1911 to 1913, and that kind of catapults him into the White House in 1912. As governor of New Jersey, he's also progressive like Teddy Roosevelt. He passes a number of anti-corruption laws. He passes election reform. He regulates corporations. He supports workmen's compensation and kind of tends to side with labor. And out of this, like I said, he's catapulted to the Democrat nominee for president in 1912. William Jennings Bryan, the most popular Democrat in the country, throws his support behind Woodrow Wilson. And so you have the 1912 election. It's a four-way race. William Howard Taft is the conservative candidate. Eugene Debs runs as a socialist. And then Roosevelt and Wilson both run as the progressive candidate. Roosevelt as the Republican progressive, and Wilson as the Democrat progressive. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's platform for 1912 is called the New Nationalism. Now, he'd been preparing to campaign before the year 1912. In 1910, he gives a speech at Osawatomie, Kansas, and this is where he lays out his new nationalism. Teddy Roosevelt's new nationalism calls for more regulation of the trusts, more reform. He wants to end child labor and have better working conditions and security for workers. Roosevelt also wants the people given the power to recall judges. He thinks that many judges have struck down reform and they're kind of an obstacle to reform. So if we can recall the judges, that'll give more democratic control to the people. In February 1912, that's when he officially runs or says he's running for president. He tells reporters that, quote, "My hat is in the ring." So if you've ever heard that phrase of a candidate throwing their hat in the ring, Teddy Roosevelt's the first one that said that. He kind of coined the phrase. Now, Roosevelt campaigns and wins the states that hold primaries. So where Republican voters get a chance to vote, they pick Teddy Roosevelt. But most states don't hold primaries in 1912, so most delegates are controlled by the conservative Republicans, and they give the delegates to Taft, and Taft wins the Republican nomination. At this point, Teddy Roosevelt storms out of the convention and starts a third party called the Progressive Party, and so basically the Republican vote is going to be split at this point. Taft doesn't really think he has a chance of winning, but his pride basically keeps him in the race. So basically the race is between Roosevelt and Wilson. Now, Wilson has a vision for America he calls the New Freedom. It's kind of similar to Teddy Roosevelt's New Nationalism. It wants progressive reform, but Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom wants to regulate the bigness of industrial America. He doesn't really want to destroy all the trust like Teddy Roosevelt does. Wilson supports stronger antitrust laws to kind of control who can crush competition. But his New Freedom is more focused on breaking up business than regulating it. He sort of sees the government as having a more limited role, break up the big trusts and then stand aside and let everyone compete and kind of do things the old-fashioned way. Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, there's similarities in their platform, and it's kind of hard to get the difference between them. I don't always understand it, but they both have platforms that call for similar things. I guess you could sum it up and say that Teddy Roosevelt wants to regulate and control monopoly as president. He thinks he has the wisdom to do that. Whereas Wilson says, no, I'm going to break up the trusts and kind of let competition just occur naturally then. So Wilson maybe is more of the limited government of the candidates, even though they're both progressives. Now, Woodrow Wilson knows that the people love Teddy Roosevelt and that he's kind of a cold, distant person. But basically, he hopes that his platform of the New Freedom will help him win. I want to read you a quote from Wilson that kind of maybe explains his differences from Teddy Roosevelt. So Wilson says, "As to the monopolies which Mr. Roosevelt proposes to legalize and welcome, I do not look forward to pleasure to the time when the juggernauts are licensed and driven by commissioners of the United States. Unregulated competition has created monopoly. Ours is a program of liberty. Theirs is a program of regulation. The history of liberty is a history of the limitation of governmental power, not the increase of it." So Wilson says, let's just break up the big companies and then let the smaller companies compete, whereas Teddy Roosevelt is more on the lines of, I'll pick and choose which companies to regulate or break up depending on how I see things. Here's what Teddy Roosevelt said, kind of criticizing Wilson. "The key to Mr. Wilson's position is a bit of outworn academic doctrine which was kept in the schoolroom and the professional study for a generation after it had been abandoned by all who had experience of actual life. It is simply the laissez-faire doctrine of English political economists 3/4 of a century old. The limitation of governmental power, of governmental action, means the enslavement of the people by the great corporations who can only be held in check through the extensions of government power." So Teddy Roosevelt's actually the bigger government of the candidate of the two. Taft, I want to read a quote about his views of government. He says, "A national government cannot create good times. It cannot make the rain to fall, the sun to shine, or the crops to grow. But it can, by pursuing a meddlesome policy, attempting to change economic conditions and frightening the investment of capital, prevent a prosperity and a revival of business which otherwise might have taken place." So kind of a hands-off approach. Eugene Debs is all in for socialism. He says, "Never for a moment mistake reform for revolution, and never lose sight of the ultimate goal, revolutionary industrial unionism." Now, Wilson is going to win the election. There's kind of an interesting event. Once again, shows how manly Teddy Roosevelt is. He gives a speech in October of 1912 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. As he's leaving a hotel, a man shoots at him from the street and hits him in the chest. The bullet passes through his speech, the cases for his glasses, and he is hit. Instead of going to the hospital, he demands that he be taken to give his speech. So he's taken to his speech, and he ends up talking for an hour and a half. He tells the audience he's been shot, but they think it's a joke and they laugh at first. But he actually opens up his jacket and they see the blood, and the crowd kind of gasps, and then Teddy Roosevelt says, "It takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose." and then everybody roars and cheers. So his third party, his Progressive Party, also gets called the Bull Moose Party. Teddy Roosevelt's spiritual animal was the bull moose. Political cartoonists just kind of made it that way. But like I said, Wilson wins the election. He gets 6.2 million votes. Roosevelt gets 4.1 million, and Taft gets 3.4 million. Wilson gets 43% of the vote. If you combined Roosevelt and Taft's votes, they would have won the election, or they would have had more votes than Wilson. But if you look at the Electoral College, Wilson wins pretty handily. Now, Woodrow Wilson is a progressive president. He attacks what he calls the triple wall of privilege, the tariffs, the banks, and the trusts. He enacts something called the Underwood Tariff in 1913. This lowers tariffs down to 25%. Republicans had tariffs up around 50%, so the Democrats lower it to 25%. The income tax, the 16th Amendment, is passed when he's president in 1913. Probably the most famous law that Woodrow Wilson enacts is the Federal Reserve Act. This occurs in 1913. Now, the nation didn't really have a central banking system, at least officially. Now, the function of a central bank is to back up other banks in case they can't meet their obligations to depositors. You know, in the past, the great banks of New York had performed this job. They kind of bailed out other banks when they faltered. But the problem was that if the banks in New York fail, then the whole country goes under. And that's almost what happened in 1907. J.P. Morgan came to the rescue. Now, the Federal Reserve Act does create a national banking system. It creates a Federal Reserve Board that supervises national banks. And then it creates 12 district banks that are funded and controlled by the member banks. The Federal Reserve has the power to issue currency to help during bank runs when cash is short. So if one region of the country is short on cash and the banks are failing, the Federal Reserve can give more money to them. It also has the power to set interest rates. So basically, if there's a monetary contraction and there's not enough credit available, they can basically create more credit. So basically, the Federal Reserve's job is to prevent economic depression. Now, when we get to the Great Depression, we'll see how the Federal Reserve fails in this, but that's their goal. Wilson also enacts stronger antitrust laws. He passes something called the Clayton Antitrust Act. This is basically the Sherman Antitrust Act on steroids. It makes the legal definition of a trust from the Sherman Antitrust Act much more flexible. So basically, if the legal definition is flexible, the government has more leeway on how to apply it, so it makes the law more powerful. The Federal Trade Commission is also established in 1914. This is established to investigate companies who violate antitrust laws or use what the government deems as unfair trade practices. So in all, the president strengthens the government's hand in dealing with the trusts, and he sets up a national banking system that will, in theory, prevent a panic or a depression. Now, Wilson didn't always support labor 100%. He tended to support the workers, but not necessarily their unions. He thinks unions are kind of special interest groups. They're radical. They don't really represent what the workers really want or need. But things kind of change while he's president. There's a number of issues going on, but one big event that happens is the Ludlow Massacre out in Colorado. There's silver mines out in Colorado, and the workers go on strike. The National Guard is brought in, and there's fighting between the National Guard and strikers in Colorado. The National Guard units end up setting fire to the tent city that the strikers are living in. The tent city burns up. A lot of the strikers die from smoke inhalation. Their family members, women and children, also die. Wilson sees stuff like this, and he starts to see that labor, in his view, gets treated poorly. So he ends up taking the side of unions and starts to see that the unions do represent the workers in his mind. So he's friendly to labor, basically, as president. Wilson also supports other laws, such as the federal child labor law, something called the Adamson 8-hour law for railroad workers. So railroad workers get an 8-hour day when he's president. And there's also something called the Seamen's Act, which eliminated age-old abuses of sailors aboard ships. Sailors tended to get treated really badly. They can get punished very severely, flogged. Wilson basically ends stuff like this. Wilson has some criticism within the United States during his first term on racial issues. He's not very good. As president of Princeton, he had kept blacks out of the college. When he becomes president, he brings segregation to parts of the federal government that weren't segregated before. Remember, Republicans have pretty much controlled the federal government from the 1860s all the way up until the 19-teens when Wilson becomes president. The only real Democrat during that era was Grover Cleveland, and he's a Northern Democrat, so he's not as bad on these racial issues as a Southern Democrat. But Wilson fires a lot of blacks throughout the South that were working for the federal government. Like I said, he brings segregation to parts of the government that previously weren't segregated. He basically told blacks that segregation is good for you and for us, meaning the whites, because the races get along better when they're separated. That's his view. Now, Republicans and blacks criticize him for this, but Wilson had a lot of shortcomings on racial issues. One black civil rights activist, James Monroe Trotter, had a meeting with him, and he kind of mocked him, and he said, "Have you a new freedom for white Americans and a new slavery for your Afro-American fellow citizens?" So Wilson gets criticized a lot for his stances on civil rights. He also shows a movie in the White House called The Birth of a Nation. If you've ever seen this is a silent movie, and the whole premise of the movie is after the Civil War, the Republican Party unleashed black people on the South. They put black people in power. They gave them the vote. They put them in governmental offices, and blacks were very corrupt. That's what this movie says. And the Ku Klux Klan rescued the South from Republicans and from blacks. So if you've ever seen this movie, it's a very positive portrayal of the Ku Klux Klan. Wilson shows it at the White House. Supposedly, he said something along the lines of its history written with lightning. Basically, it's true history. Some people dispute he said that. I don't really know whether or not he did, but he does praise the movie. So Wilson praises something culturally that kind of supports the Ku Klux Klan. Blacks obviously take issue with this. The Ku Klux Klan was terrible to black people after the Civil War. Blacks weren't corrupt in the South. There's always a little corruption in politics. If you look at the North, some of the political machines, they had tons of corruption. So there's kind of this myth after the Civil War that the blacks and the Republicans in the South were very corrupt. That's not true. It was probably just, normal amount of corruption is always associated with politics. But Wilson does show this movie. Wilson also has issue with women trying to get the right to vote. He gets picketed at the White House. Eventually, he will support women's right to vote because of World War I, but that's a little bit later. Now, Wilson wants to focus on domestic affairs. He says, "It would be an irony of fate if my administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs. All of my preparation has been in domestic affairs." But World War I breaks out in 1914, so a little bit over a year after he becomes president. The greatest war the world has ever seen up to that point breaks out. So next time we'll kind of talk about Wilson and how he deals with World War I.